Before we get started, I want to share my relevant identities to make transparent possible biases. I am white. I am socialized as a woman but use she and they pronouns. I have Welsh, English, and Lebanese ethnic origins. I hold citizenship in both the so-called United States and Australia. First, let's dive into some theory. For this portion of the presentation, I'll be using analysis from Keating's Transformation Now, published in 2013. Keating's does not use the exact term binary conceptions of identity. This is a term I have used to understand my research in relation to Keating's. The first component of binary conceptions of identity, as the term implies, is relying on binaries, right? So we have the self versus other, the center versus periphery, we have the gender binary, etc. Keating explains these second and third components beautifully on page 36. Quote, "This automatic difference-based labeling process distorts our perceptions, creating arbitrary divisions and an oppositional us against them mentality that prevents us from recognizing potential commonalities." End quote. Keating explains the fourth component on page 94, explaining that these identity politics impose unity and demand monothinking from its members. Thus, imposed binary conceptions of identity denies one's agency to define their own identity and marginalizes their own voices, experiences, etc. to fit into a constructed category. Matthias and Allen analyze that we may choose to fit into socially constructed categories to try and belong and form a community. However, this results in inauthentic connections to people as one is defining oneself in limiting binaries. As the authors discuss, this leads to being stuck in cycles of socialization. It's clear that these binary conceptions of identity depend on excluding others, but also excluding pieces of one's own identity to fit into a homogeneous category. Matthias and Allen, in the specific context of conforming to whiteness, explain, quote, "Conformity to the oppressor group means that one must take on a narrowly defined and distorted identity, make a kinship with others who have chosen privilege over justice, and mask over the original self that did not at the start of life see itself apart from the rest of humanity." Through my research, I have found that Welshness has conformed to the oppressor group, has been homogenized and nationalized to exclude Black people, other people of color, and marginalized ethnic groups from claiming a right to Welshness. Scourfield and Davies cites Williams' work in 1995 and 1999 in discussing the ways in which Black people and marginalized ethnic groups have been excluded from the Welsh nation. Wales has perpetuated and institutionalized systemic racism. Here are a few examples from page 86. Quote, "There were very serious racist riots in Cardiff just after the First World War. Just as in the rest of the UK, there were Welsh families who made their money on the slave trade." End quote. Additionally, Crawford brings to our attention the debate of not giving Welsh people of color the option to indicate that they are Welsh in the 2021 census. Crawford explains in paragraph 9 that, quote, "The census decision robs me of my right to identify as a proud Black Welsh woman," end quote. Black people and people of color that identify as Welsh have more obstacles to claim that identity than white people. This may be a consequence for Scourfield and Davies' findings in their study. They found that students at various primary schools who did not identify with being white did not identify with being Welsh either. Thus, Welshness has become exclusionary and a narrow identity politic that's linked to conventional categories of race and nationality. Scourfield and Davies cites Williams' publication in 1999 to come to the following conclusion, quote, "The cultural nationalist ideology of the Gwerin, meaning the Welsh-speaking and rural Welsh people, serves to exclude migrants who are not Welsh speakers from notions of true Welshness. Gwerin is essentially an appeal to a notion of cultural homogeneity and embodies a vision of culture and identity which is essentially static and based on ethnic absolutism." Page 92. Through the nationalist ideology of the Gwerin, we're seeing the imposing of unity, of monothinking, of homogeneity on Welshness that Keating's explained in binary conceptions of identity. Paul summarizes the problematic links between a homogenized culture and the rhetoric of nationality on page 357. Quote, "A form of cultural racism seeks to present an imaginary definition of the nation as a unified cultural community. It constructs and defends an image of national culture homogeneous in its whiteness." The English had a huge part to play in creating this homogenized national-rural identity of Gweren. England entered a binary concept of identity, positioning as the urban self to the Welsh rural other. Pritchard and Morgan explained that rural Wales, quote, is some kind of spiritual and aesthetic resource for urban England, end quote. This is found on page 116. The very terms Wales and Welsh are Saxon constructions. In the 6th century, a distinct culture was made in what we know now as Wales. The people of this culture named the country Cymru, referred to themselves as Cymru, and named their language Cymraeg. A large factor in the development of Welsh nationality was and is the resistance from Roman, Norman, and English domination and oppression. However, in entering an exclusionary and homogenized identity politic, resistance has also taken the form of oppressing Black people, other people of color, and those who don't speak Cymraeg. In efforts of resistance, when Welshness is equated to whiteness and nationality, the Welsh are speaking the language of binary conceptions of identity that work to put the Welsh nation in the position of the other in relation to the England itself. These quotes from Matthias and Allen on page 293 serve as a transition from binary conceptions of identity to a section on alternative conceptions of identity. To start this section on alternative conceptions of identity, I will start by reading a quote by Mohatni in Feminism Without Borders on page 97. Quote, change has to do with the transgression of boundaries, those boundaries so carefully, so tenaciously, so invisibly drawn around white identity. Change has to do with the transgression of those boundaries. A way to begin to acknowledge and form identity outside of these binary conceptions of identity is to enter a process of self-splintering. Keating cites Sandoval to define this concept as a violent shattering of the unitary sense of self. Keating cites Sandoval to further understand the term differential consciousness. Quote, within the realm of differential consciousness, there are no ultimate answers, no terminal utopia, no predictable final outcomes. Its practice is not biologically determined, restricted to any class or group, nor must it become static. In conclusion, Keating states, quote, differential consciousness converts binary oppositions into a context-specific pluralistic approach. Page 109. I think it would be nice to pause and understand the differences between binary conceptions of identity and this self-splintering alternative conception of identity that is non-binary in nature. Binary conceptions of identity are static, homogenizing, oversimplified, predictable, and oppressive. Non-binary conceptions of identity are dynamic, context-specific, complex, unpredictable, and provides opportunities for connection. Keating states, quote, this violent shattering does not represent a negation of one's selfhood. It is rather an opening up, an expansion, a transformation. Page 108. Mohatni discusses that the concept of unity, quote, is not based on sameness and there's no perfect fit, but there is agency as opposed to passivity, end quote. Page 103. In understanding these quotes, I've come to the following conclusions. In binary conceptions of identity, categories are imposed on us. In non-binary conceptions of identity, we are given the agency to decide what identity means to us based on our specific context of experiences and the agencies around us. This does not mean that we throw out these conventional categories of race, nationality, etc., but rather that we conceptualize our identities through a multitude of pathways. We must not conceptualize our identities through a paradigm of sameness, but rather through an understanding of our differences. Mohatni advises, quote, to understand our collective differences in terms of historical agency and responsibility. Mohatni urges us to, quote, understand race, class, gender, nation, sexuality, and colonialism, not just in terms of static, embodied categories, but in terms of histories and experiences that tie us together. Through this research, I do not aim to suggest that Welsh people or Cymru reject Welsh nationalism. Instead, I aim to provide a framework from which we can acknowledge the connections to Welshness or Cymru culture that have been marginalized by a homogenized and nationalized export of quote-unquote Welsh identity that conforms to whiteness. Because Cymru myth and legend is so foundational to Cymru culture, I wanted to take Mohanty's advice in understanding difference through, quote, histories and experiences that tie us together, unquote, by looking at the transnational origins of Cymru myths and legends that are tied to the symbol for Welsh nationalism, the Leek. Pritchard and Morgan argue that an integral piece to understanding an ethnic group is to understand their myths. This said, it's essential to note that Welsh mythology does not capture the entirety of Welsh culture, and certainly not the few narratives I've picked to present today. I do not aim to tell the Welsh how they should be Welsh, as that would not be my place, and would only recycle a binary conception of identity in which people passively claim identity categories that have been imposed onto us. Rather, I hope to provide a framework to explore avenues in which Welshness can engage with non-binary concepts of identity. The Leek is the national emblem of Wales. There are many theories for why this is. One theory is that in the 6th century, St. David asked Welsh soldiers to wear the Leek to distinguish them from the invading Anglo-Saxons. It was during the same time period that warring Welsh kingdoms united for the first time to fight against Anglo-Saxon invaders and marks the official beginning of the English-Wales divide. This legend for how the Leek became the national emblem of Wales is ingrained in a binary conception of identity based on nationality. If we look closer into Leek symbology, we can understand its transnational origins in Welsh legend. Leek gardens were sacred to the Celts. The Celts were made up of many European nations we know today, including the Cymry. Leek's sulfuric smell reminded the Celts of lightning. Thus, leeks were connected to the god Aed, who was the bearer of the lightning bolt. Aed was also known for healing. Germanic tribes saw the shoots and leaves of the leek as swords, spears that can be used to fight ice and frost giants and demons of disease. Nordic warriors wore leeks in battle to protect them from wounds and to help them win. Druids thought leeks had healing power and had a relationship with the Celts because the Celts would consult them when warring with the Saxons, and St. David, even though he was Christian, was familiar with Druid teachings and traditions. The Cymry, who again was a part of the Celts, had connections to Nordic warriors, Germanic tribes, and the Druids, which may have influenced their own connections to the Leek. St. David's use of the Leek in battle against the Saxons may not have been a marker against an other, but rather used to protect against wounds and for its healing power. Rome invaded what we now know as Wales in 55 BCE, so the Cymry's culture had an influence from the Romans. Mars is a Roman god in Roman mythology and is known as the god of war and agriculture. According to Vichel and Cardiff Naturalist Society, March 1st is not only the day in which the Welsh battled against the Saxons, but is also the day to celebrate Mars, quote, which in his honor wars were undertaken against hostile tribes, end quote, page 38. But as Mars is the god of war, he is also the god of agriculture, and the Leek is under the dominion of Mars. It is said he may engage in war to protect the growth of plants. So the Leek can heal and protect against war wounds, and it could also be a marker to identify against the people that are invading a place that the Cymry have looked after. The Leek is the national emblem of Wales, but through investigating the transnational symbology and connections to the Leek and associated mythology, it's clear that the Leek isn't only used as a symbol in binary conceptions of identity. The Leek can also be a symbol in alternative or non-binary conceptions of identity. The Leek can be a symbol of navigating resistance to oppression through protest, war, violence, and can be a symbol of protection of Welsh culture from English domination, and can also be a symbol of healing the divides across conventional categories of race and nationality. I've hoped to continue previous research on deconstructing Welsh nationalism as it has moved from being a form of resistance to a tool of exclusion and binary identity politic. As Welsh culture is largely foundational on myths and legends, I hope to further this conversation by diving deeper into Leek symbology to uncover Welsh culture's transnational origins, thus uncovering possible avenues for connection through a complex, dynamic, and non-binary identity politic. There are so many avenues for continued research. It would be important to look at decolonial theory, understanding its implications for the Cymry, and how that might change the quote-unquote conclusions of this research. An avenue to connecting decolonial theory to my research could be understanding how colonialism has created binary conceptions of identity, including race and nationality. A good starting place would be Tuck and Yang's Decolonization is Not a Metaphor, and Frantz Fanon's Wretched of the Earth. An ecofeminism and transnational feminism analysis would be helpful in furthering this research. The nation-state is often tied to women's bodies, and the feminization of nature can perpetuate virgin versus whore dualisms in relations between nation-states and in environmental discourse. A place to start this research could be Scattered Hegemonies, edited by Inderpal Gruwal and Karen Kaplan. If one wanted to understand the relationships between Welsh women's bodies, environmental destruction, and Welsh nationalism through Welsh mythology, a starting place could be Roman goddesses Juno's representation in the Onnyd, and the Welsh myths of Bronwyn and Geowyn. So that's all the research I could fit into this long video. I want to thank Dr. Xiaomei Pu for being my advisor, and I want to thank the other member of our research team, Eliza Van Dyke, for helping me and supporting me through this individual part of the collective research project.